Chapter 7 of Seminar 19 begins with a four-part argument that is at once summative and right at the end, elusive and elusive as hell. First point, about the mathematical real. The real is the limit of the symbolic, we've often discussed. And we can approach this limit using language. And one mode of language use is better suited for this approach than others, mathematics. At issue in mathematical approaches to the real, Lacan thinks, are not signifiers, nor even letters, but, as we've discussed in this series, variables, and always written variables. Mathematics, in other words, approaches the real in what Lacan calls a highly specified form of writing, where variables appear as placeholders in propositional logics, formulations that are designed to capture certain functions. Now that sounds abstract and more theoretical than you'd probably like, but it's actually quite simple, these formulations. 2 plus a equals 6. Little a here is a placeholder and an algebraic formulation. 2 plus what equals 6. Now, in regular mathematics, you know the answer to this question. When you solve for a, when you solve for the placeholder, when you ask what goes in that missing empty place, if you will, it's the number 4. 2 plus 4 equals 6. So at some basic level, Lacan is thinking at the level of algebra and the use of variables to hold places that require solutions, sometimes even new formulas. This is also what you see in the algebraic expression in each of Lacan's 4 formulas of sexuation, this capital I with a circle in it next to a little x. That little x is a variable. So also is the x that occurs elsewhere in each of those formulas. These little x's are variables for which to solve. Some of them represent men, some represent women, but the I next to the X, the capital phi next to the little italicized variable X, is about enjoyment. The point here, though, broadly speaking about the mathematical real, is that we need to solve for these variables. And solving for these variables, according to Lacan, is the work of science, the practice of which is hysterical and extends from Socrates all the way up to analytic inquiry, especially as Lacan thinks of it. So we are now getting to this point in Lacan's thought where he's coughing up what he truly means by science here, this hysterical enterprise. And the model for this, as arguably even more of a beautiful hysteric than Hegel, is Socrates. We see that here in these chapters we're reading from Seminar 19. Socrates is presented as the hysteric scientist that starts analytic inquiry off. Now, that's not entirely precise, but it's good enough for us to hold in mind that this work that Lacan is doing in approaching the real via mathematics and through propositional formulas structured around variables is fundamentally for him the work of science, radical scientific inquiry. Second point in this 4-part argument that begins chapter 7 in Seminar 19 is about the one, the only, our much beloved discourse of the analyst. We've talked a lot about this discourse, about how it works, paying special attention as ever to the point where it ruptures, thereby establishing it as a matheme. That's how we get into these discourses. Discourses are mathemes because they mark certain impasses. They are always ruptured discourses, as Lacan tells us here in Seminar 19. Here at the start of chapter 7, Lacan adds this. From the discourse of the analyst, the phallic function emerges. That's the new point. That's the second point in this argument. It's not just about the discourse of the analyst, it's about how the discourse of the analyst turns us on to the phallic function. Only after Freud invented analytic experience could Lacan develop analytic discourse. This is his claim, and it's one that we've echoed in this series. What he's adding here is this. It's only after the development of the analytic discourse that Lacan could then go on to formulate what he calls the phallic function. Third point in this bizarre opening four-part argument on my reading. It's about the organ, but not as you might think it. It's here that Lacan's opening argument around the organ, but not as we might think it, becomes, I believe, elusive. And really elusive, too. The phallic function, which appears in each of Lacan's formulas of sexuation, shows that enjoyment of this sort, of the phallic sort, revolves around the organ, an organ. And the organ in this type of enjoyment always operates as an implement, as Lacan calls it on page 84 of the English translation we're using here. This, he claims, is, and I quote, something new. And yet, notice what happens in the fourth moment of this argument that he starts off with in chapter 7. Rather than develop this new point about the organ as the implement, as the thing around which the phallic function revolves, Lacan zooms out, shifting from the phallic function to the formulas of sexuation in which this function recurs. And oddly enough, this is the big turn in chapters 7 and 8, to the big other, whose non-existence these four formulas of sexuation prove. Now, how all this hangs together, that is exactly what Lacan attempts to show in chapters 7 and 8 of Seminar 19. And it's exactly what we here in Lectures on Lacan are going to try and suss out. Now, it's tempting, though, nevertheless, in this moment where the organ is on display, to pursue its logic, this organ logic of phallic enjoyment, at the level of barred and lacking subjects pursuing the parts, the organs, the implements that they hope will make them feel whole, in keeping with everything we already know about surplus enjoyment, as the fundamental fantasy that links up with commodities, and we can go on and on with that. Surplus enjoyment is founded on a fundamental fantasy of completion and consistency. And it's very tempting to work this fundamental fantasy into logics of surplus enjoyment qua commodity consumption, and from there straight into an account of phallic enjoyment at the level of parts purchased to help us feel whole. You see? You know this logic backwards and forwards. It's tempting to run with it. It's even tempting to ask what exactly is new about what Lacan is doing with the organ here in Seminar 19. Now, when he says organ, however, I want to say something a little different than what you might think he means. When Lacan says organ in chapter 7 of Seminar 19, he's not just thinking at the level of organ enjoyment. More broadly, and he doesn't say as much, he doesn't explicitly say this, but this is exactly how the argument unfolds from here, which is allowing us to say the following. I think the broader point he's making about organs is occurring in the wake of Aristotle and in the wake of Kant. And in fact, if you really want to just attend to the history of Western thought, you can rock Aristotle and you can rock Kant, and you be all set. Now that's a lot, that's a big claim, but you got Aristotle and you got Kant. You can account for a lot of what happens in between by just reading your Aristotle and your Kant. Again, big argument, probably going to receive a couple emails about that one, but what the fuck? Big arguments is almost always how we arrive at breakthrough stuff here, no matter how risky they are. And here's what I want to say along those lines. It's not at the level of the organ or the body part that Lacan is thinking here. He's thinking like Aristotle and Kant at the level of the organon. And I don't mean this in the Greek as an apparatus or an instrument or implement for experiencing, I don't know, whatever it is, here, phallic enjoyment. That's not what I mean by organon here. I'm thinking here of the organon as a body of principles, not the part of any one body, as a system of rules, as a full motherfucking blown logic for radical scientific inquiry, here into logics of sexuation, four logics of sexuation in particular. So when Lacan cues up organ, I don't just want you to hear this in terms of surplus enjoyment, commodity consumption, and parts in search of holes and all the, we're not even, you can just set all that aside and think bigger here at the level of the organon, at the level of the Aristotelian and Kantian systems or bodies of principles that structure a certain form of radical inquiry. That's what these four formulas of sexuation are. They are logics of sexuation that participate in a system that allows for radical scientific inquiry. And you're going to see in these chapters what Lacan then wants to use that system to inquire after. I would also like to suggest here that it's in pursuing the distributed oppositions between these four logics, these four formulas of sexuation. And let me be clear, when I say distributed oppositions, I do see Lacan's point here and I agree with it. These formulas are obstacles to each other. They don't negate each other. They don't cancel each other out. There's not that kind of logic happening here. The relationality, if you could put it that way, between the formulas of sexuation is one of a series of obstacles. They serve as obstacles to each other. They don't negate each other. And that's really important when you start thinking about not all feminine enjoyments being phallic. That doesn't mean that feminine enjoyments that are non-phallic cancel out phallic enjoyment. Lacan's very careful about this. Negation is not the theme here. Think instead in terms of barrier. Think in terms of obstacle. These formulas serve as obstacles to their counterparts. And that's an important logic to have in mind as we start working through their so-called relationality. It's here, I believe, in pursuing these obstacles that the formulas pose for each other, that I think Lacan discovers further proof that the organon of society itself, the big other, does not and cannot exist. And that is exactly what he wants to do in these chapters, is to focus on this point once again, bringing in the capital A, big other, in order to show once more how it doesn't exist and to what extent. Why does all this matter here? In what appears to be a discussion of sexuation, not society. Discordant small others, not totalizing big ones. In other words, what the fuck's a big other got to do with any of this? The reason why it's important is because this turn towards the big other, even though Lacan is zooming out in order to account for it, it allows him to drive home his point about the sexual non-rapport, about why there's no such thing as a sexual relationship, about why the Aristophanic fantasy of union, that's the sexual relationship that we fantasize about. You find you're missing half and you come together and you form a perfect sphere. It is a symptom of the fundamental fantasy of completion, consistency, and the like. What Lacan is here trying to show is that the reason why there's no such thing as this wholeness, this completion, this Edenic sexual rapport, about why this Aristophanic fantasy of union between one's lost and found lover is only ever just that, a fantasy. Indeed, the fundamental fantasy. And he thinks that by queuing up the big other, he can drive this point home even more. So let me state this plainly and directly. and in a way that I believe builds on much of what we already know from Seminar 14 to the early 1970s Lacan, which is where we now find ourselves. Here's how I think it all hangs together right now. Because the big other doesn't exist, there is no universe of discourse, no universalizing discourse, under which to subsume men and women, masculine and feminine subjects, and more precisely still, masculine and feminine enjoyments. And I want you to hear the important word here being one of universe. There is no universe of discourse, which I then clarified and said no universalizing discourse. To remind you that when Lacan talks about universes of discourse and universalizations, he's thinking at the level of an operation, at the level of a function. To universalize is to make multiples into one. It's to turn verse into one, unus, a multiplicity. Universalization is an effect. And what he really means by that is oneification. There is no discourse that does the work of oneifying men and women. Because the big other doesn't exist, there is no broader, overarching, totalizing, fully encompassing universe of discourse under which to subsume men and women, to unify them, if you will. That's the primary stake in him queuing up the big other here. But let's take it from the opposite angle. You could shift this and have a different argument and arrive at more or less the same insight. From the other side of things, if you will, we can certainly arrive at another point. Lacan's 4 formulas of sexuation, they annul, they void, and they render inoperative what he here calls the function of the big other. And this inoperativity is precisely what ensures that the opposition between the sexes is grounded only in discord, Lacan says, in that they can in no way be established on the basis of a universal. There's that word, universal, is from page 91 of our translation. The 4 formulas of sexuation, when you start looking at how they serve as obstacles to each other and what vanishes in the midst of their barriered relations, what you wind up seeing is an annulment, a voiding out, and an inoperative rendering of the function of the other, and all of which serves only to ensure that the opposition of the sexes is grounded only in discord. That's the English word that we have here from Lacan. In discord. It's a discordant relation, if anything. And the reason why that is that it can in no way be established on the basis of a universal. Again, there is no principle or guiding rubric by which to oneify these. So there is always an element of difference and discord between them. So what does this mean for you, me, everyday life, in and beyond the clinic? Simply put, what this means, I believe, is that the world of discourse just isn't big enough to encompass both sexes. But it's the only world we know, my friends, which means that discord is our destiny. The sexual relation, hear me now, it just doesn't stand a chance. And yet we never stop wagering on it. And that is what this amounts to for everyday life. What Lacan is showing us is the sexual relation doesn't stand a chance in a world where there is no universalizing discourse. And yet, nevertheless, I would even say precisely for this reason, we never stop wagering on its prospect. And this wager, I would suggest, is part and parcel of the phallic function. Not just operationally, but also, more importantly, I'd say here, conceptually. This wager is fundamental to what's happening with the phallic function. This function, this phallic function, Lacan suggests, is the closest thing we have to the function of the big other. Now, that's another wild claim, but I do believe it is supported and sustained in chapters 7 and 8 of Seminar 19. The phallic function is the closest thing we have to the other function, and with it, the fantastical promise of a sexual relation, defined by wholeness, completion, fusion, and the like. But only insofar as we continue to believe that somewhere, somehow, some way, for someone, the phallic function is not operative. And you start to hear how I'm starting to shift into these formulas, and you know the daddy in question here. Why? Because it's only by imagining someone to whom the phallic function does not apply that we can totalize all men in a complete universal set, in keeping with the basic operational logic of the big other, as a counting operation goaded by totality, completion, and the like. So notice the shift here. The phallic function Lacan is suggesting is the closest thing we have to the big other's function, and with it, this fantastical promise of a sexual relation, this Aristophanic fantasy of wholeness, completion, fusion, and the like. The phallic function allows us to keep that dream alive, but only insofar as we continue to believe that there is someone who can escape it. Because that someone, that excluded, exceptional one, is the very thing that props up the total category of the all. And that total categorization of the all is what allows us to feel like we're in the presence of the big other, because only the big other can do that work. But there's just one hitch. We can't find this motherfucker. Where is this exceptional one, this someone to whom the phallic function doesn't apply? The dilemma here, it comes down to some simple shit. We can't find this exceptional man. We can't find this motherfucker. And you know what? That's exactly what he is. The mythical, fictional, inexistent figure of an uncut, uncastrated real man with exclusive sexual access to all the mommies. That's why I call him a motherfucker. He's the missing motherfucker. The problem with the fantasy of the father of the primal horde, which we've been talking about following Lacan's lead from Seminar 17 forward, and by the way, notice how these translators going in here, messing with Seminar 19, there are multiple spots in this text, in the English translation, where Lacan is not explicitly talking about the father of the primal horde, but instead his Oedipal relative. And the translators go in like, yeah, actually, he just misspoke again and again and again. And they go in and rewrite that as the father of the primal horde. Now, they do a good job of noting that. And I think that's really a responsible scholarship there. But as you're reading through the English translation, note there's oftentimes an end note, a translator's end note, whenever the father of the primal horde is mentioned. And you go to the back and it's like, yeah, Lacan didn't say that shit, but we pretty much think that's what he's talking about. I'll let you think about that and do with it what you will. And I wonder if you just read Lacan to the letter, if you might come up with some different insights. I, however, tend to agree. The father of the primal horde seems to be the one represented by Lacan's formula of sexuation for the excluded one to whom the phallic function does not apply. But let's get back to that problem. If indeed he's talking about the father of the primal horde, yeah, there's just one problem here. The problem here with the fantasy of the father of the primal horde is that it often blinds us to the fact that this motherfucker doesn't exist, cannot exist, no matter how hard we will and worship otherwise. Again, let me be categorical. And because I'm feeling a little spicy, let me also be a little bit contentious here. You might not think this is a contentious point, but reading Seminar 19, you can immediately see how my work with modal logics is differing from how Lacan's work. And if you read some commentary on this text, you oftentimes see some serious confusion around the modalities as well. So again, categorical and perhaps contentious. The existence of an uncastrated man beyond the phallic function is straight up impossible. It is in the modality of the impossible that we can talk about the existence of an uncastrated man beyond the phallic function. And what you've heard me say before still is true here, I believe. This impossibility of the existence of an uncastrated man beyond the phallic function is necessitated, if only logically, structurally, by the fact that all men are castrated. If all men are anything, there must be no man that props up the category of all men. We've been through this. You already know this. And not just because you've been following lectures on Lacan, but because you deep down understand the logic of the all and the none. If all masculine enjoyments are phallic, what does this mean? It means that no masculine enjoyments can be otherwise. But in order for this all to hold, this impossibly masculine position of non-phallic enjoyment, it must remain something for men. Not to encounter in everyday life, but to ponder, to dream about, to fantasize about, to masturbate to, I would even say, in order for them to remain men. If you've got ears to hear, what we are rehearsing here is the relation between the masculine formulas of sexuation that Lacan provides. You've got your upside down capital AX next to the phallic function, which tells you that all men, all X are castrated, all X enjoy at the level of the phallic function, next to this other formula, the formula that props up the former. This backwards capital EX next to the phallic function with a line over the top. The line over the top, which you know negates whatever falls underneath it. If all men enjoy at the level of the phallic function, that categorization of all men, that totalization of all men, can only be guaranteed by the prospect that there is one man who escapes that logic, a no man relative to the all men that logic applies to. And that is the myth of the father of the primal horde, the myth that props up so much toxic masculinity, especially in the West, that if you just engage in enough hetero-primitive accumulations of parts, of women, of objects, of commodities, call it what you will, if you just accumulate enough notches here and notches there and counts here, and one by one they start to stack up, you see where we're going with this. You might actually become that one exceptional man, the at least one who escapes the phallic function. That's why I say that motherfucker doesn't exist, but we never stop dreaming about him, about the possibility of the impossible becoming me. All of this is still on Lacan's mind in Chapter 7 of Seminar 19. Let's consider a passage. We haven't opened the book yet in this lecture. Let's look at some passages. And there are some great ones to show you where his thought is along this relationship between all men and the no man. The all men, all the sons, and then the no man who has this fantastical access to all the women, which doesn't exist either, by the way. Page 92 is a good one for us. It shows where Lacan is at this point in his thinking around masculine enjoyment. We're about, a dozen lines down. The sentence begins, "Nothing imposes this at least one." Check it out. Nothing imposes this at least one, except the unique chance. It still has to be gambled Remember what we're talking about with the wager, that something might be functioning on the other side, but as an ideal point, as a possibility that all men could reach. Reach how? Through identification. There is but a logical necessity here, which is imposed only at the level of the, guess what? Wager. So what he's saying here is that the backwards EX next to the non-phallic function, the phallic function negated, it imposes this fantasy that there is at least one, and that we, through unique chance, through pursuit of idealizations, identifications, might indeed become that. This unique chance on which we must wager. But all we're wagering on ever is a logical necessity. It's a logical necessity that gives us the myth of the father of the primal horde. But we mistake that impossibility for a possibility. And I think that's where Lacan and I really differ here. When he wants to assign the possible to the modality as the modality to the father, what he means is, in the field of fantasy, men fantasize about possibly becoming him, becoming the father, becoming the uncut daddy. It's a fantasy of possibility. But that fantasy of possibility, and this is my point, belie a fundamental fact of impossibility. The logical necessity that produces the myth of the father of the primal horde produces that figure of the father of the primal horde as an impossibility, as one who cannot be, whose non-existence cannot be avoided. And yet we see men wagering on the opposite. And that's what Lacan is emphasizing here. And the field of fantasy, they're always taking that chance, wagering on that possibility, on this ideal man. And they're doing so through identification in the field of desire, in the field of fantasy. This, however, is nothing more than a wager. Next paragraph. Observe, however, what results from this concerning the barred universal proposition. Moreover, it is in this respect that the at least one, by which the name of the Father is supported, the name of the mythical Father, is indispensable. Now, he's messing around with this at least one, but it's not a really complicated mess around, so don't worry about it. What he's saying here is that the E next to the X, the backwards capital E next to the X, means that there is at least one person for whom whatever follows applies. So you read that there is at least one, someone, for whom the phallic function is inoperative. That's what he's doing with the at least one. There is at least one to whom the phallic function doesn't apply. And then when we come to the other side and talk about feminine enjoyment, you see that backwards EX canceled out with a negation over the top, which counters the point, opposes it, creates a barrier or an obstacle to that point by saying there is not at least one for whom the phallic function is inoperative. We'll come to that in a second, but I want you to just remember when he's talking about the at least one, he's pointing to the backwards EX. There exists at least one. That's what he's messing with here. So don't get too hung up on it. This is where I am offering an insight that is missing in the function, Lacan continues, in the notion of species or class. It's in this respect that it was no accident that this whole dialectic was bungled in the Aristotelian forms. Yeah, okay, Lacan, we get it. Aristotle didn't get it right. You're here to correct Aristotle. Got it. I don't really give a fuck about Aristotle, Lacan, whatever. Like, I'm in it for the thought. I'm working at something here. And whether he wants to try and overcome Aristotle or see himself in Aristotle's wake, it's readily apparent that that's part of what's happening here in Seminar 19. If you were to ask Lacan, like, what's the history of Western thought look like? Note, I'm not talking about philosophy. What does the history of Western thought look like? You could see him, you might even like it cross his eyes a little bit. Aristotle, Kant, Lacan. It's just a thought here. But you can see once more that you have something bungled happening in Aristotelian thought. And Lacan thinks that the corrective he's adding is the same corrective that set theory would introduce into mathematics in the formulation of the empty set. I mean, that's ultimately where this is going to come down for him. But at this point, he's talking about the classification, the speciesification of any given multiplicity of individuals. The categorization known here as all men is a special or class-based category in the sense of classification in the Aristotelian sense of things. And what Lacan is saying is, in order to have a totalizing class or a complete species, there's this other thing that nobody had considered prior to Cantor, one of the great inventors of set theory, namely that there's always this excluded no one that guarantees and props up the total classification of all ones. And that's the logic that we've been working with. It's also the logic that fucks up the big other, as we've seen in our series from Seminar 14 forward. So a lot of this you already know. But Lacan is reminding everybody that this is what's indisputable. This is what's indispensable. This is what he is offering. This is the insight that is missing in most talk of classification, categorization, totalizations, is the way that if everything is packed for the camping trip, nothing has been left behind. And Lacan's point is that nothing that has been left behind is something that you have to turn the car back around and go get. In order for everything to be included, nothing must be left out. And that nothing for Lacan is indeed something. And it's the very thing, the very no thing, that props up the collection known as everything. Here, that collection, that classification is all men, being propped up by this no man, this name man, this name of the Father, this figure of an impossible man that we nevertheless keep wagering on. In the end, next paragraph, where does this backwards capital EX come to function? This, there exists at least one who is not the serf of the phallic function. It is merely a requisite, I would say, of a desperate type. And if you follow that translator's endnote, of a hopeless guy, from the standpoint of something that is not even supported by a universal definition. However, note that it is not even supported by a universal definition. However, note that with regard to the universal proposition written upside down, capital AX next to phi next to the X, this proposition that says, if we translate it into words, from symbols into letters and then letters into words, if we translate this, the proposition in question here is all men, all masculine enjoyment is phallic enjoyment. What he's saying here is every male is serf to the phallic function. That's what that means. All men are serfs to the phallic function. That's how he reads the formula you see on 92 here. What is meant by the at least one that functions to elude this? So all men are serfs to the phallic function, but then there is at least one man who eludes this serfdom. I shall say that it is the exception. We're talking about the exceptional man. This is indeed the one time when the proverb that says, without knowing what it says, the exception proves the rule, turns out to be confirmed. So the rule here is all men are castrated. And the exception is the fantasy of there being at least one man who is not, which is logically necessitated and also perfectly contradicted by the first formula that says all men are castrated. If all men are castrated, there cannot be one who is not. It's impossible if the first statement holds true. It's peculiar, Lacan continues, peculiar, that it's only with the analytic discourse that a universal can find its veritable fundament in the existence of an exception. So the universalization of all men, which approximates the totalizing logic of the big other, this universalizing logic that likes to convert multiples into ones, likes to oneify, to universalize things. This logic of the big other that you see playing out at the level of all men is a universal that finds its veritable fundament in the existence of an exception. And that exception, again, is the myth of the primal father of the horde and blah, blah, blah. And that's really all it is. It's a bunch of blah, blah, blah. That's why I emphasize that this figure, following Lacan, is inexistent, because he only exists at the level of his name, at the level of the myth, at the level of the stories and the promises that we all make, at the level of the porn. That's where the father exists. But it's at that level that he only ever exists as a fantasy figuration. That motherfucker's never going to walk up your driveway and knock on your door. These paragraphs that we just considered are wonky, but also quite precise. They are not, however, summative. If you want a summative statement of what he's doing with masculine enjoyment at this point, turn back a few pages to page 88. Page 88 shows Lacan summarizing all of this, pointing directly at masculine existence, masculine fantasy, and ultimately at masculine enjoyment. It's the second full paragraph that begins with the word at. Check this out. At the level on which sexual relation would stand a chance, not of coming about, but simply of being hoped for, beyond the abolition, the dismissing of the phallic function, we only ever find the presence, dare I say, of one of the two sexes. I'll let you wager which of those two sexes shows up. Let me repeat. Like all fantasies, this one, this hoped for, belies a more fundamental fact. The fact that in reality, if we can say that, the sexual relation, again, does not stand a chance. So you hear him working with this wager, this gamble, this unique chance in the field of masculinity, this unique chance that maybe you could become the real man. And this is the closest thing we come to standing a chance of having a sexual relation. And what Lacan keeps coming back to, though, is that the sexual relation just doesn't stand a chance. That wager, you're going to take those odds, that's a pretty damn bad bet. And yet we make it day in and day out. The masculine formulas of sexuation posit the existence of an exceptional man. This is the fantasy. Masculine formulas of sexuation, these two formulas, capital A, X next to capital I, X, with the A being upside down, that says all of masculine enjoyment is phallic, and this backwards EX next to the negated IX that says none of this particular man's enjoyment is phallic. These two formulas for masculine sexuation, they posit the existence of an exceptional man to whom the phallic function does not apply. But notice, the first of Lacan's two formulas, as you just heard me say, for feminine enjoyment, call bullshit on all of this. And that is the function, in many ways, of that first formula for feminine enjoyment. The backwards EX negated next to the capital IX negated. This one that says some of her enjoyment is phallic, and offers the complement to the other formula for feminine enjoyment that says not all of her enjoyment is phallic. So if you want the bumper sticker, which runs the risk of missing a lot of Lacan's points, but nevertheless the bumper sticker is Some of her enjoyment is phallic, but not all of it is. We'll come to that as we come to it. I'm queuing it up now because this masculine fantasy represented by the two formulas, one that gives us all men enjoying at the level of the phallus, and this no man who somehow escapes that logic, all of this is called into question by the first formula of feminine enjoyment that Lacan comes up with. And you know it well. It's, again, that backwards EX with the line of negation above it, next to the capital IX, phallic enjoyment, with the line of negation above it. And it says the following: there does not exist someone for whom the phallic function is inoperative. So there you have it. I told you that these formulas serve as barriers or obstacles to one another. This formula for feminine enjoyment is a barrier or obstacle to the formulas for masculine enjoyment. So the formula all men are castrated depends upon, has as its logical necessity, this fantasy of an exceptional man, this at least one man for whom the phallic function is inoperative. And that formula reads, there is at least one person for whom the phallic function is inoperative. That formula, however, is contradicted. It is opposed. It meets a barrier or an obstacle in the field of feminine enjoyment, the first formula of which directly opposes it by saying there does not exist someone for whom the phallic function is inoperative. Women prove that there is not someone for whom the phallic function is inoperative. You can imagine the effects that this proof has on masculine fantasies of exceptional men. In logic and fantasy alike, we can posit an exception to the rule of phallic enjoyment. And here, by rule, think domination. Don't just think of the organon as a body of rules that allows for inquiry, something like that. Think of rule as in when Lacan's saying the exception proves the rule. Think of rule here as domination. In logic and fantasy alike, we can posit an exception to the rule of phallic enjoyment, to the domination of phallic enjoyment, yet again as our closest proximity to the failed other that is big. But in everyday life, we're faced with the fact that this exception does not exist. Except in statements of this sort, where we pronounce its impossibility. Now do you see how all this is starting to hang together? In logic and fantasy, we can posit exceptions to rules left and right. But in everyday life, in lived experience, that shit doesn't exist. That's what the first formula of feminine enjoyment shows us. It confronts us with the fact that this exception doesn't exist, that there does not exist someone for whom the phallic function is inoperative. And what it does is it allows us to then say things like this, like exactly what you're hearing in this lecture. This is real talk, if you want to put it that way. It's real discourse from the radiophony address forward, because it's in statements like the ones you're hearing right now, where we can talk about how impossible the exceptional man is. That is a name of the real. That is a statement of impossibility. In the myth of the father of the primal horde, and in his formulation, what we see is impossibility pronounced. And by that, I mean a name of the real. The name of the father is always at this level a name of the real. Notice how Lacan attempts to illustrate the discord that results from these formulaic mashups, these oppositions or obstacles to each other. He attempts to illustrate this by noting the discord between the two backwards capital E formulas that he's been working with. He labels the masculine fantasy of an exceptional man with the number 1, and the feminine fact of his non-existence with the number 0. So the masculine fantasy that there is someone for whom the phallic function is inoperative. Lacan's like, okay, there's our number one. Get it? There's an exceptional one. There's at least one. There's someone who escapes the logic. That fantasy he represents in figures with the number one. And the other formula, why does Lacan use 0 to represent it? Because what that other formula says is there are 0 people for whom the phallic function is inoperative. There does not exist anyone for whom the phallic function is inoperative. They completely zero out that population in a way that men instead preserve at least one member. Men believe that there is one who eludes the phallic function. Women, however, prove that there is no such thing. This, I believe, is precisely where the big other comes in. The masculine fantasy of an exceptional one man props up a deeper kinship with the totalizing logics of the big other. Make no mistake, and I don't mind laying it on the line here, all men is an avatar of the big other. Think back to what Lacan is doing with avatars in Seminar 16. And isn't this yet another way to read the upside down capital A in Lacan's formula for all men? It's a figure, perhaps even a disfiguration, of the right side up, capital A, that he uses to represent the big other. Let that be your reminder of its status as an avatar for the big other, which does not exist. And what about the feminine side of things? That's where we're edging toward now. I think it's time to just make that switch. What about the feminine side of all this? What does Lacan's first formula of feminine enjoyment, this backwards EX negated next to the capital phi X also negated, what does this tell us about the big other? That it, like the father of the primal horde, does not exist. Again, let me try and be categorical here, and I believe directly in line with Lacan's thought. This first formula for feminine enjoyment, it is a signifier of the barred other, of the fact, not the fantasy, that the function of the big other has been annulled. Why? Because everyone we meet, men and women alike, everyone we meet is to some extent defined by the phallic function. It's for this very reason that the exceptional man, the real man, is always missing, absent, lacking in the would-be big other's societal count. That's what the first formula of feminine enjoyment also tells us. It says everyone we meet is to some extent subject to the phallic function. There does not exist anyone for whom that function is inoperative. That's what that formula says. And what that means is that the exceptional man for whom this logic is inoperative doesn't exist, is lacking, is missing, is always absent, is a lack within the field of the big other. And when we say as much in lectures like this one, and when we write as much in formulas like the one we're considering, what are we doing? We are signifying this lack. The first formula of feminine enjoyment in a very interesting way. Interesting because it's not using signifiers, much less letters for that matter. It's mathematically signifying this lack, even if only enigmatically, as a statement of impossibility. It's impossible to find someone who's not a little to a lot or entirely governed by the phallic function. And as you know, there is a long-standing algebraic symbol for signifying this lack in the big other. You see it in the upper left-hand quadrant of the graph of desire, which we've discussed at length in other series. A capital S next to a barred big A in parens. This is the algebraic symbol for significations of the other's non-existence, for significations of lack in the big other. And Lacan, not surprisingly, he cannot resist queuing up this algebraic symbol. Just to the right of the page we considered, page 88, on page 89, you get him queuing this thing up. And notice again the emphasis on gambling. What I want to tell you is that at a certain level, the one where sexual relation stands a chance, this backwards capital EX with a line over the top, namely the statement that says there does not exist, there is nothing else, this absent, and I don't know why he needs the Greek in here, it means basically another. This absent other, heteros, this absent another, is on no account necessarily a special privilege of the feminine sex. This is a really interesting point here. The first formula of feminine enjoyment is not a special privilege of the feminine sex. It applies to all beings, if you will. All sexuated beings fall under this formula he's suggesting here. Why? Because all of them are, to a greater or lesser extent, subject to the phallic function. We haven't yet met one, man or woman alike, that doesn't fall under, to some extent, the rubric of the phallus. This is simply indicative of what, on my graph, here the graph of desire, I'm saying this because it's had its own small fate. I wrote as the signifier of the barred other. This means that however you take it, from the moment sexual relation is at issue, the big other is absent. From the moment the sexual relation is at issue, the big other vanishes. Which brings us, at long last, to Chapter 8 in Seminar 19. The opening riff of which is centered on the meaning of this signifier of the barred other in the context of feminine enjoyment. And not just in terms of Lacan's first formula of feminine enjoyment, but in terms of what he calls the duality of her jouissance. That's the thing about feminine positionality. There's a duality of jouissance there, and it's that duality that we're going to end on. Lacan's first formula for feminine enjoyment, this backwards EX next to IX with the bars over the top, it calls bullshit, you've heard me say, on the masculine fantasy of the exceptional man, thereby undermining the formula for the father of the primal horde, this backwards EX next to the IX with a bar over the top that says there exists some man for whom the phallic function is inoperative. It's simple. Men insist that there exists someone to whom the phallic function doesn't apply. There's that formula. And women prove otherwise, showing that there does not exist anyone of this sort, transforming, and this is the point here, men's lack of evidence to the contrary into evidence of a lack atop which their fantasies are structured. So what this amounts to when the first formula of feminine enjoyment pops and calls bullshit on this masculine fantasy of the exceptional man, this exceptional man that they cannot find, this exceptional man that will never walk up your driveway and knock on your door, this exceptional man that does not exist, this exceptional man who is fucking impossible. When the first formula of feminine enjoyment shows up and calls bullshit on that, what they do is transform the masculine lack of evidence of the father of the primal horde into evidence of a lack, atop which and around which the entire masculine fantasy is structured. Enter Lacan's second, more famous feminine formula. You know it. You've seen it before. What this formula does in the context of the conversation we're having about calling bullshit on masculine fantasy, this second formula, it damn near offs the thing. I dare say it puts the nail in the masculine coffin. As you know, this second formula of feminine enjoyment reads upside down capital AX with a line over the top next to the formula he offers for phallic enjoyment. And it reads as follows: not all of women's enjoyment is determined or governed by the phallic function. That AX with a line over the top, that means not all. Not all of women's enjoyment is governed by the phallic function, is how the second formula reads. Or as Lacan puts it here in the chapters we're considering in 7-19, she harbors another jouissance besides phallic jouissance. And one which I would add, on no account, as Lacan points out as well, an other jouissance that does not depend, on no account does it depend upon phallic jouissance. So that's part of what's going on with this other jouissance enabled by the formula, not all of her enjoyment is phallic. It's one that does not depend on phallic enjoyment for its authority or experience. And yet, as Lacan's going to point out at the end of chapter 8, it doesn't negate phallic enjoyment either. That's what makes it elusive, and that's why it's deserving of our attention here. Lacan has yet to call this capital O other jouissance. But I think he's heading in this direction. In his formulas of sexuation, the big other vanishes, he says. It becomes structurally absent and posited as such. The word he uses for this is alterposed. And you can see the translator's notes at the end of chapter 8, where he's quipping about what happens to the big other in the midst of all this shit. It becomes alterposed. So it vanishes and becomes structurally absent, but then is posited as such. It is posited, alterposed. Let's consider this passage and do so carefully, because it really does put us on the path of this second formula of feminine enjoyment that, as you heard me say, puts the nail in the coffin of masculine fantasy. The page in question, if you ask me, is on 104. Lacan alludes to a lot of what's going to happen on 104 in earlier pages, but 104 is where it all kind of comes together. It's the third full paragraph that begins, "There's a good reason." So what we have here is we are looking now at that second formula of feminine enjoyment, the one that says not all of women's enjoyment is phallic. So the second part of the bumper sticker I gave you. The first formula says some of women's enjoyment is phallic. The second formula, though, the one we're looking at now, says, but not all of her enjoyment is phallic. That's what we're going to try and crack here at the end of chapter 8, page 104 in the English. There is a good reason for my initially having to get a foothold on the big O other. The big other, hear this well, is therefore an inter, the inter that is at issue in sexual relation, but displaced, and precisely on account of being alterposed. So he's messing with variations on the word inter, which is Latin for between. So interest, the etymology of that is being in between. Inter plus esse gives you interest. Interest is here readily apparent in the word inter. Being in between is having an interest. Here we have this inter that Lacan toys with and gets us to an alter that is then posed, stored, even as it vanishes. You can work through that one. Again, follow that translator's endnote. Next sentence. It's curious that in positing this big other, what I have had to put forward today only concerns woman. Indeed, she is the one who gives us an illustration of this figure of the big other, an illustration that is within our reach, on account of being, as one poet wrote, between center and absence. And this is the crucial turn that brings clarity to so much of what has gone on before in these two chapters, especially around woman and her enjoyment. A few lines down. What does between center and absence become for her? It becomes, Lacan says, this second bar that I have only been able to write by defining it as not all. Not all is she who is not contained within the phallic function. That part is key. If some of her enjoyment is phallic, but not all of her enjoyment is phallic, it means that feminine enjoyment occupies a liminal position, where some of it falls within the purview of phallic jouissance, and some of it does not. And what that means is that not all of her enjoyment is contained within the phallic function. It exceeds that function. And yet, here's the point, without being its negation either. This not all that allows feminine enjoyment to exceed the phallic function is not a negation of the phallic function. Her mode of presence is between center and absence. The center is the phallic function of which she partakes singularly. And now we've got all the terms we need to put these motherfuckers in place. Men, women, masculine, feminine, enjoyments. Lacan gives us a center, an absence, and a presence in between an inter. There's a center, there's an absence, and then there is a presence in between, between. Let's define each of them in turn before we part paths for the time being. The center in question is phallic enjoyment, you just heard him say, as symbolized by the capital phi, the capital I with a circle in it, X. When Lacan says center, he means phallic enjoyment. The absence in question, what Lacan on the very same page, if you just keep reading, calls jouissabsence, kind of an awkward lexical mashup there. This absence in question that he calls jouissabsence on the same page, this is what he means when he tries to index women's access to a mode of enjoyment that is not phallic, as represented in the second formula for feminine enjoyment that says not all of her enjoyment is phallic. It's absent from the phallic function, which is why he's toying with absence here. And yet without negating phallic enjoyment. Now that last part deserves just one more turn of the screw, because the formula for the myth of the father of the primal horde, notice what is happening there. It negates the phallic function. The phallic function has a line over the top. That means it's negated, it's rendered inoperative. The father is, in the field of fantasy, this one person for whom that function is inoperative, is negated. And Lacan's being very careful to point this out. The part of women's enjoyment that exceeds the phallic function does not do so by negating the phallic function. It is not rendered inoperative by the fact that not all of women's enjoyment is phallic. In other words, by the fact that women experience jouissabsence, another way of enjoying beyond the phallic function. It's a beyond that does not function as a negation. And that is very different from what you see in the formula for the father, none of whose enjoyment is phallic. So notice the opposition there. None of his enjoyment is phallic, so the fantasy goes. For her, not all of her enjoyment is phallic. That's different. Her enjoyment beyond the phallic function, to reiterate, does not mean the negation of the phallic function, and that is wildly distinct from what men fantasize about relative to the father, to this exceptional man, whose enjoyment always is a negation of phallic enjoyment. The formula for this jouissance, as you know, is that upside down capital A with a line over the top that again says not all of women's enjoyment is phallic. Okay, you got that linked up. We got our center and we got our absence, at least in mind. We're going to draw them in a second, but for now, it's just good to have them in mind. One more term, one more conceptual confusion that I believe will bring some clarity here. What can we say of the presence that is at stake here? Lacan just tells us there's a center, an absence, and a presence in between. The center is the phallic function. What's absent from that function is represented by the formula for jouissance in feminine enjoyment that says not all of her enjoyment is subject to the phallic function. And then in between, Lacan says, there is this presence. What of this presence? What's at stake here? Again, Lacan presents a lexical blend, a coinage of sorts for us to think on. Jouissance. I don't know, it's kind of just, it's a clunky-ass expression, but he's adding absence to one and presence to the other. And you've already heard me say, echoing Lacan, that there is a duality, a twofoldedness to feminine enjoyment. And now you're seeing what that is. Relative to the phallic function, one is present and the other is absent. Let's see how this plays out. You know the formula that he's got in mind for this presence. It's the backwards EX with a line over the top of it next to the phallic function negated. And what that says, as you've heard me reiterate time and again in the past few lectures, is this. We have yet to meet anyone, masculine or feminine, whose enjoyment is not a little or a lot, or even in the case of men, entirely governed by the phallic function. The presence that he then describes as jouissance presence is the presence that is captured by this first formula of feminine enjoyment, the backwards EX negated next to the phallic function negated, that says we have yet to meet anyone, there does not exist someone, whose enjoyment is not a little or a lot, or even in the case of man, entirely governed by the phallic function. There does not exist anyone, male or female alike, for whom the phallic function is inoperative. You could translate this formula a lot of different ways, but all of these, I think, bring clarity to it. So if the absent parts of feminine enjoyment are not phallic, but without negating the phallic function, what we can say is that the present parts of feminine enjoyment, represented by this other formula, they are phallic. What this means is that feminine enjoyment, it only shows up in the symbolic order looking like masculine enjoyment, namely as an enjoyment in the wake of castration, in the field of symbolic alienation. In other words, as phallic enjoyment. But this doesn't mean that it's the only way that feminized subjects enjoy. It just means that it's the only way that their enjoyments can be figured, linguistified, symbolized, known, in short, presented. Hence the emphasis on presence here. This is the part of feminine enjoyment that can be presented, that can show up, that can appear, that you can see and can encounter in the world, unlike the absent one. All of this, I believe, lends itself to a terrifically clear and coherent diagram. And it's one that I think I'd be remiss to leave undrawn in this lecture. And I think you should draw it with me. So here's what I would suggest. Get out a sheet of paper, as big or as small as you like, but a standard size sheet of paper would be great. Turn it into landscape, so it's longer than it is tall. That'll help you draw it, but really all you need is this and an ability to draw some circles And you'll see exactly how all of this shit hangs together. First things first, draw two circles next to each other, but not overlapping, just two circles next to each other, one to the left and one to the right. And then draw a third circle, a larger circle that wholly encompasses the circle on the left, but only intersects with the circle on the right. So if I were going to draw this with you, and I'll do it here so that we can all be on the same page, it would look something like this. You have two side-by-side circles, and then the circle on the left is encompassed by a bigger circle that goes all the way around it, and that circle is just big enough to intersect with the circle on the right. This is the starting image to start wrapping our heads around all of this. The big circle that encompasses the circle to the left, this is the phallic function. This is the so-called center in Lacan's terminology here at the end of chapter 8. Everything that falls within this larger circle is what he means by center. And it's what the phallic function means. The encompassed circle, the circle on the left, that is completely encompassed by the larger circle of phallic enjoyment, you know what this is. This is men. This is all men. This is the formula that says all men are castrated. And you can write it right in that circle to the left. And what that shows you is that the large third circle you drew of phallic enjoyment totally, wholly encompasses all men. All men are subject to the phallic function. That's why the circle that I label men, the circle to the left, is perfectly and wholly included in the larger circle of phallic enjoyment. No man escapes that logic. And now do you hear it? No man escapes that logic. Well, who's he? How can I get to know him? I want to be like that when I grow up. No man escapes phallic function. Well, who is that? Isn't this some great Homeric shit? This is fucking Odysseus, right? You got to wonder who the Cyclops is in all this. No man has blinded me. Nobody has blinded me. Lacan has some good stuff to say about this no man, this nobody, in his earlier work. But here I think we can just say no man escapes the center, this gravitational field of phallic enjoyment. And the fantasy of men then is, how do we get that motherfucker to the party? This no man that escapes. Once you get your head around this stuff, you can start laughing a little bit because it's so ridiculous when you start seeing how these fantasies play out. Okay, let's get to that intersected circle, the circle to the right, the one that is partially inside the orbit of phallic enjoyment and partially outside. I think you know where this is going. If the circle to the left that is totally encompassed by phallic enjoyment belongs to men, the circle to the right that is intersected by this larger circle of phallic enjoyment belongs to women. And I'm going to put quotation marks around men and women because we're not talking about anatomy here. These are masculinized subjects, all of whom are governed by the phallic function. And here are feminized subjects, whether they have penises or not. These are feminized subjects that are partially governed by the phallic function, but not entirely governed by it. You see? We're working on that intersectional circle. The part of the feminine circle that appears inside the larger circle of phallic enjoyment is represented by Lacan's first formula of sexuation, this backwards EX with a line over the top next to the phallic function, again with a line over the top. The one that reads, some of her enjoyment is phallic. Why is this formula inside the center known as phallic enjoyment, because what we know, what experiences teaches, the reality that is contingent, but nevertheless applicable here, is that some of her enjoyments are phallic. There is not one person, male or female alike, for whom the phallic function is inoperative. These are the aspects of feminine enjoyment that can be presented. And so that's the part of her circle that appears inside that of phallic enjoyment. This is what Lacan means by presence. This is the presence of feminine enjoyment in the center, the centrifugal orbit of phallic enjoyment. It's the part of her enjoyment that can be figured, linguistified, symbolized, known. This is the part of her enjoyment that can be represented, presented in the field of phallic enjoyment. What about the part of the feminine circle that exceeds this? The part of the feminine circle, the circle to the right, that falls outside the circle of phallic enjoyment. Well, if you're looking at your drawing and you're considering your notes, you know exactly which formula goes in this other side. It's the upside down AX with a line over the top next to the phallic function that says not all of her enjoyment is phallic. And so here in the circle of femininity, you have the two formulas. Some of her enjoyment is phallic, but not all of it is. Some, but not all. That's how we read what Lacan is up to here with feminine enjoyment. For men, all of their enjoyment is phallic. For women, some, but not all of her enjoyment is phallic. And you know the term that Lacan would assign to this not all part, the part that exceeds the phallic function. This is where he is applying that third term we were just considering, absence. The part of the feminine circle that exceeds the larger circle of phallic enjoyment is absent relative to that larger circle. This is the part of her enjoyment that exceeds the phallic function and that shows that not all of her enjoyments are phallic. Here what we have are the aspects of feminine enjoyment that cannot be presented. In other words, that remain absent from phallic enjoyment. And if you want to see this in a much cleaner and more coherent way, I went ahead the other day and drew it with some more colorful markers, which I'm going to hold up now on the screen, but also use this as the tile for the video so you can have access to this image where everything is traced out a little more clearly. For your enjoyment, the masculine circle is blue, the feminine circle is pink, and of course, cautionary as fuck, the phallic circle is orange. But it's the same logic. I'm holding it up here with all the formulas and the statements all written out. I've even included your uncut daddy down here in the lower left hand. I'll post this image so you all can see it if you're just listening to this recording, which is totally fine as well. At this point, I think we have a sense of how all four of these formulas work together in an obstructionist kind of way. They work as obstacles to each other. And that is precisely how Lacan sees them. They don't negate each other. They simply pose barriers to each other. He's used modalities to talk about these barriers. Here, what we're now using are not modalities, but topologies. That's what you have just drawn. What you have just drawn is a topology of feminine enjoyment. And you know what else? All four of those formulas are present. And they're present in a way that allows this topology to operate as a matheme, as the marker of a certain impasse or two. We'll start there next time.